So what I'll be discussing is aerosol generating procedures, implications, and safety measures for the airway managers. So hopefully, my topic is slightly different, so I won't be repeating as there'll be other repetitions. So what is an aerosol generating procedure? Aerosol generating procedures are any procedures carried out on patient that can induce production of aerosols of various size, including droplet nuclei, and they can propose or present a risk for opportunistic airborne transmission of pathogen to healthcare worker. So this is a risk to us. Now, what is aerosol? Now, aerosol is simply defined as a tiny particles or a droplet suspended in air, and sometimes they are of sufficient concentration. They are toxic to our body. But if you see WHO guideline, according to the current evidence, they says that it is primarily transmitted between people through respiratory droplet and contact routes. So there's a lot of confusion among us about the terminology. So we'll discuss that. So what is aerosol and what is respiratory droplets? Essentially, all of this are a fluid bundle of infectious particle of various sizes. Now, if you compare a virus here, which I have described, virus is the smallest particle, or coronavirus is the smallest particle compared to all other bacteria and other bigger organisms. The division between aerosol droplet and droplet nuclei are right now mainly based on the size. There is a confusion about nomenclature also. The evidences and the articles are writing some particle as droplet, someone writing as a large droplet and small droplet. There is also a droplet nuclei has been described separately, and in some literature, droplet nuclei and aerosols are termed or considered same. One thing which is important, that as size decreases, they go deeper in the airway. So those who are aerosol or droplet nuclei, which are of 5 to 10 micron size, can go and reach the lower airway. So droplet is a fluid bundle of infectious particle that travels from respiratory tract of an infected individual. Routinely, droplets are considered when they are larger than 20 micron size. They are too big to follow airflow, and routinely they have a ballistic type of trajectory. So once they come out of patients or an infected person's mouth, they try to settle down to the nearest surface as fast as possible. There could be small droplets. They are also considered droplets. The size varies from 5 to 20. In some literature, it is described between 10 to 20, or somewhere it is 5 to 20. The size, small droplet which is size around 5 to 20 micron, tend to hang up around the glottis, but it is very difficult for them to go beyond that. A droplet nuclei is a respiratory droplet which is sort of a dehydrated. So once the liquid evaporates, the size goes below 10 micron size or sometimes 5 micron size. They reach that inspirable range. So you can inspire them, and this can reach to the lower airway. The aerosol is a smallest particle, less than 5 micron. It is like mist or fog. So they are in respirable range. They can enter lower respiratory tract, and they can also hang in the atmosphere. They hang in the mist or a cloud, and they remain suspended in the air for a longer period. One literature where they've done it in a experimental situation, where it tend to remain there in the atmosphere for 3 hours. So aerosols are formed in our body. Aerosols are generated when there is surface tension of the fluid lining of the respiratory tract are disrupted. They are overcome by the forces. This could happen because of 3 reasons. One could be rapid shearing airflows. Like when we speak, the airflow is 3 to 5 millimeter per second, but when we cough or sneeze, it can reach up to 100 meter per second. So that rapid shearing airflows, vocal cord movement, which can occur while we are talking, while we are coughing, the vocal cord movement itself can generate aerosols or droplets. And again, opening and closing of terminal airways can also generate the aerosols and droplets. They are all influenced by type and force of a respiratory activity. So for an example, talking would be generating 600 droplet per minute, but coughing and sneezing would generate large amount of droplet, which can have lot of viral particle. In case of COVID-19, a lung involvement where coughing, atelectasis, decreased compliance lead to higher pressure gradient for breathing. So patients who are infected with the viral disease generate more particle, more droplets than those who are not infected. Also, distal airway collapse in COVID-19 leads to increased terminal airway open-close cycling, which leads to greater aerosol formation. So not only cough or sneeze, but even exhaling to a closing capacity or like deep breathing can also, or talking loudly can generate more aerosols. So the particles, once they are made or produced in the body, from there the transfer to the potential healthcare worker depends upon many factors that include size, shape, velocity, density, temperature, and humidity. In fact, a very interesting figure which is given in this particular article, which says that for the patient respiration, there are a lot of factors like minute volume, airway surface area, expiratory flow velocity, closing capacity, how frequently you are doing. Then it depends upon temperature and humidity of the atmosphere and ultraviolet light, the composition of respiratory tract fluid lining. Also, it depends upon what type of mask the person who is receiving this is wearing, what type of filter or what type of barrier he has, how much time he is exposed, what sort of PP he is wearing. So all these factors decides how much person is going to get infected. Now, we've been little confused about aerosol and droplets. The WHO in March suggested that direct and indirect contact with the help of droplet, and in some cases airborne transmission when aerosol generating procedures are carried out, are the reason for transmission of COVID-19. But with lot of pressure for international scientist community, in July they've added they've considered that poorly ventilated closed atmosphere airborne transmission is also possible in absence of aerosol generating procedure. So even if you are not doing aerosol generating procedure, airborne transmission, which happens with the aerosol, which remains suspended in the air, is also possible if there is a poorly ventilated closed atmosphere. So for aerosol generating procedure, aerosol and droplet, both form of transmission. That means the direct contact of droplet or aerosols which are suspending in the air is possible with the help of aerosol generating procedures. And in addition to this mode of transmission, aerosol generating procedures also create opportunity for direct contact and fomite transmission. So all in all, there are multiple reasons why the aerosols and droplet can infect the healthcare worker. Now, what is the evidence? How do we know that aerosol generating procedure can actually infect? Our evidences are mainly had come from the SARS outbreak of 2002 and H1N1, previous H1N1 infections. Those evidences are of low, I would say low quality or a weak evidences, but they do suggest that individual procedure may increase risk of viral in transmission. Also, in those previous exposures, nurses were more commonly infected than doctors. This suggests that proximity and time exposed, which also occurs during this aerosol generating procedure, where patient is already in respiratory distress. Patient is coughing, has a labored breathing, airway collapse and sputum productions are all high in this patients, this group of patient. So aerosol generating procedure by sheer aerosols and droplet, and also because of close proximity to a patient who is also generating aerosols naturally, is the reason for the aerosol, I would say, transmission of infection. So if you see list, there are many societies have come out with the list of aerosol generating procedure. This is one NHS which has come out where intubation, extubation, tracheostomy, manual ventilation, open suctioning, bronchoscopy, non-invasive ventilation, high frequency oxygen, induction of sputum, dental procedure, some cautery procedure. So they've come out with lists, and other societies has also come out with various other lists. That includes World Federation of Society of Anesthesia, WHO has also come out with guidelines, and this has created some confusion. So if you see these three guidelines, NHS says administration of pressurized humidified oxygen and nebulization is not aerosol generating, versus WHO says that nebulization is an aerosol generating procedure. So there is confusion, and what we'll try to do, analyze today, is we'll analyze the applied physiology associated with each procedure. We'll view what is the evidence which is associated with that particular procedure and what is the risk. Now here I have and also this literature has rated this as moderate, high and very high. No one has given risk as very low or no risk, because it is not possible to consider low risk or no risk because you are actually in close proximity with the patient. So there is always moderate would be considered on the lower side of risk, and high and very high would be a higher type of risk. So this is the list of aerosol generating procedure, and we'll discuss each separately. So now let us take a spontaneous breathing patient. A spontaneously breathing patient exhales a conical jet plume that assumes to be at 2 meter up to 2 meter in length. Healthcare worker, when we inhale the air is drawn from say around 10 centimeter around us. So close proximity should be avoided, and whenever it is possible, we should remain 2 meter away. Even simple addition of face mask will reduce this conical jet plume. So it will not allow conical jet plume to go to a larger distance, and mask will act as a barrier which will reduce the spread of the plumes. Coughing, dyspneic breathing are natural aerosol generator, as we already understood the mechanism behind it. This was associated with healthcare worker transmission in SARS-CoV-1. So risk of aerosol generation and disease transmission if patient coughs or has a dyspneic breathing is on the higher side. Oxygen face mask, the procedure itself is not aerosol generating. It is more of an aerosol dispersing technique. In fact, face mask can act as a barrier to high velocity particle plumes, leading to redirection and dispersion in a different direction. But if you put a face mask on a patient, the plume can be reduced, the plume distance can be reduced to 0.1 to 0.4 meter with application of face mask. But if you have mask which has exhalation port, the risk remains same. Then the plumes will go to the 2 meter distance. Dehumidified cold gas could strongly promote viral viability, so that is against this particular procedure. And adjustment of the mask was associated with risk of transmission in SARS-CoV-1. So risk of aerosol generating can be considered high to moderate, since it is reducing the plume. If you have proper mask, yes, the plume distance can be reduced, but dehumidified and cold gas could create a problem. So you should be careful while you are adjusting the mask or applying the mask. Bag and mask ventilation, there is definite aerosol generation with high pressure, which you are creating while giving positive pressure ventilation, and airway collapse, which routinely occurs with bag and mask ventilation. Both these factors promotes aerosol generation. It was also associated with high healthcare worker transmission in SARS-CoV-1. So here the risk of aerosol generation and disease transmission depends upon, of course, you are very in close proximity with the patient, but also depends upon technique which you are employing with the high pressure or lower pressure. The mask seal, if your mask seal is good and if you are using HME, the disease transmission is on the lower side if your mask is totally properly sealed on the patient. See, laryngoscopy under anesthesia and relaxation. If done after appropriate relaxation, airflow and expiratory output will terminate. And patient is not coughing, there is no airflow, so aerosol particle would start settling in airway. So if you have done it after proper relaxation, aerosol particle is less likely to come out, and force generated by gentle laryngoscopy is unlikely to cause the aerosol generation. But this is only possible if you are doing laryngoscopy under relaxation. So aerosol generation is less likely if it is done under relaxation. But if it is done while patient is spontaneously breathing, aerosol generation is equal, can be high. And now if you see all the list that includes the previous studies which have been published, they said their aerosol generation with intubation procedure is there. It is high. They say healthcare worker transmission is high. But here, the intubation procedure involves more steps other than laryngoscopy. So bag and mask ventilation, close proximity, patient is coughing if you're not done the proper relaxation. So all these things leads to more chances of aerosol generation and transmission to healthcare worker other than laryngoscopy. Only laryngoscopy itself, the procedure itself is less likely to cause aerosol generation if it is done under proper relaxation. Suctioning creates shear force because of a high airway velocity. It causes significant negative pressure. It can cause coughing. So it was associated with increased viral aerosol in H1N1 in outbreak. So risk of aerosol generation and disease transmission is on the higher side. High flow nasal oxygen, our understanding has dramatically changed since the outbreak. When it was earlier in March 2020, we considered high flow nasal oxygen therapy as highly aerosol generating, and we were discouraging now. Now our understanding has improved, situation has slightly changed. High flow nasal oxygen will disperse the concentrated jet aerosol. So patient is spontaneously breathing, the jet aerosol which is coming out, the aerosols which comes out are more dilute in concentration and they are more dispersed. Plus heat and humidity which is created with high flow nasal oxygen can decay virus, and this can in fact reduce viral, I would say improve viral decay, reduces the viral load. Also with this there is a CPAP generation, so there is a decreased airway collapse and airway pressures. All in all, this is factors prevent air, this is aerosol protective, except that this is done with unsealed circuit. So patient's viral load is still going to the atmosphere. We are not closing. So if you put mask over that, things would be much better, but that is not possible with high flow nasal oxygen. And it is now widely used as a COVID treatment protocol, and no study has come out with a clear-cut understanding that aerosol transmission was actually happening to the healthcare worker. So right now it is being used across the world for the treatment of the COVID-19 patient. So risk category would be on the lower side. It is still there, but it is on the lower side. Non-invasive ventilation, again there is a I would say generation of CPAP, so there is a decreased airway collapse and pressure. There is if your mask is properly sealed and if you are using HME, it is beneficial. It also depends upon your viral filters and minute volumes which you are generating. It has been, that association has been tested in limited studies, and it has been found useful in small group of patients, and it has found that in small group of patients, healthcare worker infection was not there. So risk of aerosol generation and disease transmission could be high to moderate because it is still generating airflow. Nebulization, as I said, it is a most confusing procedure. Different society statement puts this procedure in a different categories. After composition of it alters composition of respiratory tract fluid lining. It increases more viscosity, which reduces the surface disruption, respiratory tract fluid disruption. So it reduces shear force. The droplet which it would be making would be a larger droplet, which could now travel to the shorter distance. Also, medical aerosol, which is created by the drug, would collide with patient's airborne particle, which would make large droplet, which will again travel to a shorter distance. Bronchodilation will help in reducing the aerosol production. So risk of aerosol transmission is on the moderate side. Extubation has high chances of coughing and a distal airway collapse, both promoting the increased aerosol production. This has not been studied so far, but the risk of aerosolization is considered very high. Bronchoscopy is one clearly identified with aerosol, increased viral aerosolization in H1N1 cases and also SARS-CoV-1. it is associated with high airway pressure, distal airway collapse and coughing, and it is risk of aerosol generation is considered extreme or higher side. CPR. Now, cardiopulmonary resuscitation because of distal airway collapse, chest compression, suctioning creates shear forces, and unsecured Bagmont ventilation. Multiple people in close proximity will create a very high risk of healthcare worker transmission. This was demonstrated in SARS-CoV-1 as well as H1N1. So you must identify the deterioration earlier and try to avoid the cardiac arrest. And if cardiac arrest occurs, you should consider situation or whether to go ahead with the CPR or whether the withhold of CPR would be beneficial to the healthcare worker. So risk is extremely high. Surgical arrest, the procedure itself, cutting the skin and putting the bougie is not going to create the increased aerosolization. But the immediate release of high amount of aerosol as soon as, because there is a airway collapse, there is airway blockage, and as soon as you create the as soon as you open up the airway, newly formed cricothyroid and tracheostomy, there will be release of aerosols. So that is dangerous. Though it is not studied much, the risk potential should be considered very high if you are performing surgical airway, especially in an emergency situation. So considering the applied physiology of all the airway procedures, the precautions which you can take, this is universal. I think the other speakers will also repeat this. So in environment, you can increase ventilation, room ventilation rate. If there is no formal ventilation, at least you can open windows or door if that is possible and permissible. You can increase temperature and humidity, that will improve viral decay and avoid small crowded room. Patient should wear surgical mask, avoid sneezing, talking or coughing once he is in operation theater or once he is there for the procedure. Avoid high minute ventilation, expiratory flow and volumes, and avoid atelectasis. Healthcare workers should wear proper PPE, visor, which is use most efficient airborne mask protection available, whatever is the best available to you. Keep away from your direct exhalation plume. So you should keep away from direct exhalation plume and minimize your close contact with the patient. The nasal breathing will trap virus in the nasal area, while oral breathing allows all droplet and aerosols to go down to the airway. Should minimize shear stress on the airway, avoid airway opening and closing. Of course, that is the main mechanism. Avoid bronchoscopy, CPR. Use fitted sealed mask with viral filter. Minimize suctioning and prevent coughing. So all in all, these are the precautions which you can take to reduce aerosolization in case of aerosol generating procedures. So at conclusion, I would say that though there is a limited evidence on association between between the procedures and the viral transmission, we have to be careful because they are still associated in past with the infection to healthcare worker. In patients with high viral load, respiratory symptoms and procedure that may increase airway shear force, opening and closing of airway cycling, and if you are not using viral filters, you should be careful. And we should not limit meticulous airborne precautions only to the procedure period, but the protection during all time, so that air plumes which are there or airborne particles which are there in the atmosphere for some longer period, you should avoid aerosolization of that. Thank you for patient hearing.
There was a question put up by somebody, I'm not getting the name right now. And I think I would ask Apex Bhai, Amit Bhai and Dr. Rakesh to address it as to the choice of the neuromuscular blocking agent for intubating the trachea. So if one of you or either all of you can have your own opinion. And the corollary to the question was, should we use succinylcholine when there is no anticipated difficult airway? So I think we'll go alphabetically. We will start with possibly Amit Bhai.
Dr. Amit?
I think either of the drug, succinylcholine, rapid acting muscle relaxant is must. That is for sure. Rapid acting muscle relaxant. Now we have only two choice. Rapid acting, one is rocuronium versus succinylcholine. Now rocuronium, if you end up in say unanticipated difficult intubation and you're not able to intubate, the reversal is difficult here. We don't have drug available for that. So sugammadex. So I would probably go for succinylcholine. Now the succinylcholine can be used in all the cases.
Yes.
Why not? Whenever there is a suspected airway, COVID patient, I think we should use succinylcholine.
Exactly.
By Amit bhai, this is I think you have addressed this. Dr. Kamal Akbar, Afridi has asked this about how about the aerosol in the operating room and how to clear them after intubation. Kindly comment on it. I think Amit bhai, I think you'll have to go through those things that you already showed us during the early part of your talk.
Aerosol generation is a concern in operation theater, and the best scenario is to have air exchanges. So you should have a laminar airflow where air exchanges are taking place, and as for the time constant theory, within 5 to 6 air exchange. By 6 air exchange, 99% of the aerosols or the viruses in the atmosphere would be cleared and filtered through the HEPA filter. So you should at least wait for 6 air exchange. Now, suppose if you have an operation theater with facility having say 12 air exchange per hour, routinely it is anything more than 12, preferably it is 20 to 25. So if you have a 12 air exchange per hour, that means within 6 air exchange, that is in 30 minutes, your aerosols or the virus load would be less than 99%. So if you have a 24 air exchange, you will have 15 minutes. So you need to have 15 minutes before taking the next case. Your air filtration system should be on for 15 minutes so that all viruses are clear from the operation theater atmosphere, and then you can take the new case. So it depends upon what number of air exchanges you have in operation theater, and 6 air exchange clears 99%. So you can always identify that what air exchanges you have in your operation theater and decide the time.
Yes, I think that I look at it the same way. Like if the ideal world would be that everybody has that AIR, that's this airborne infection isolation room with a negative. I don't think many of us have it. So if your best bet is if you have the laminar flow with positive pressure and a very high, the higher cycling rate, it is good. So if it is, as you said, more than 15, more than 20, greater the better. Just two things that I keep in mind is the exit areas, which are at the bases and usually at the corners of the room. There is a tendency to keep equipments over there, ensure that those are free so that the air quickly passes through that area. And usually most of your operating rooms would have a 20% fresh gas that comes in, fresh air that comes in with each cycle. And the problem is
very happy,
that Amit bhai mentioned this early on, was if you don't have positive pressure and you you have the split air conditioning system, I think then is the real challenge. There have been several ways that people have described about creating a negative sump, but then that is not very environment friendly. And otherwise opening the rooms, windows, etc., and doing
opening the windows whenever it is permissible at the end of operation theater, and continuing your air conditioning system so that the gas or the air leaks out through the windows to the outside. Now, if you open the door and then it will be spread to the inside the operation theater and the OT complex, that is not advisable. Your door should be closed. But if you have a window which takes it to the outside, that is the best. Your anesthesia machine should have scavenging system which takes it directly outside the operation theater into the atmosphere. So scavenging system in your anesthesia machine, and probably if you have a laminar airflow, probably a window from where you can divert it to the exterior directly into the open atmosphere. That is more important, I would say, advisable than keeping it directly. If you don't have window, then I don't know what we can do about it.
And